and welcome to today's webinar. This is the 7th episode of our 12-part series on countermeasure strategies for pedestrian safety. Today's presentation is going to focus on pedestrian safety at interchanges. The presentation today will be delivered by Megan Mittman. Megan is a senior associate with Fair & Peers, and we're very happy to have her here today. My name is Dan Jolene, and I will be facilitating the webinar today. Attendees, if you can hear me, I'd like to ask you to please click the hand icon located in the upper right-hand corner of your screen. That will let me know if you're here, or that you can hear me, I guess. So I'm going to take a look around and make sure, and I do see the hands going up. Thank you all for joining us here on this Thursday afternoon. We're very excited about the presentation we have today and the fact that you all were able to make some time to listen in. Before we get started, I just wanted to go over a few administrative details, basically covering the webinar software and some other information. If for any reason your computer freezes during the presentation, please just reload the website, log back in, and you should be able to rejoin the session. We have already posted the presentation slides from the webinar today on our archive page, which you can visit at pedbikeinfo.org/webinars. You can find our archive page there. We will be recording the webinar today, and we'll be posting a video of that recording to that same website, so you will be able to look back at anything you missed. The presentation slides, as I mentioned, are up now, and you can expect to see the video archive within about 1 to 2 weeks. Note that attendees won't be able to speak during the webinar, although you will have the ability to submit questions and comments using the chat feature of the GoToWebinar software. You can feel free to ask questions at any time. We will be holding about 20 to 30 minutes at the end of the webinar for a discussion. Later today, you're all going to receive a follow-up email from the UNC Highway Safety Research Center, which will include a link that will allow you to generate a certificate of attendance for the webinar. If you're attending the webinar with multiple attendees at your site, please make sure to forward that message to each of them. So if you were the one who registered for the webinar with your email address, you'll be getting the email. So be on the lookout for that, and please be sure to forward it around your group to others who may not have registered themselves. The email is also going to contain a link to the website where we posted presentation materials from today's webinar. And as I mentioned earlier, within about 1 to 2 weeks, the page will also feature a copy of the presentation materials with an embedded recording of today's presentation. The webinar has been submitted to and approved by the American Planning Association for 1.5 CM credits. You can check the online AICP event calendar for more information about claiming those credits. I'd encourage you, if you want to learn more about PBIC webinars, check out upcoming sessions, or view archives of past webinars. You can find all of that at pedbikeinfo.org/webinars. For this series in particular, many of you may have attended some of the past episodes. These are the next 3 webinars we have coming up. So if you haven't been able to attend the past episodes, take a look at these topics. These might be something you're interested in taking a look at. If you happen to miss these sessions, again, they will all be archived and put up on the website. So just a note on that. You can see the link at the bottom of the page here is where you can find all of the registration links for the upcoming webinars, as well as all of the archive material for the past webinars. So it's all in one convenient location. Before we start the feature presentation today, I just want to take a quick poll of the audience. We're interested in hearing from you about how many participants are attending the webinar from your site. If you wouldn't mind taking just a few seconds and casting a vote here, really we're after some information about how many people are attending today. So just let us know if it's you by yourself attending the webinar at your desk, or if you've got a few people with you or a larger conference room full of folks. We're just interested in getting those numbers. So if you can take just a few more seconds, so we don't spend too much time on this, so we'll go ahead and move on with the presentation from there. All right, maybe 10 more seconds on the poll, and then we'll close it down. Okay, I appreciate all of the feedback on the poll. Thank you very much for taking some time to do that. I'll close the poll now. And with that, I think what we'd like to go ahead and do is roll right into the presentation. So Megan, keep an eye on your screen. You should be asked to go ahead and share your screen, pull up your slides. I'll let you know when I see them. Okay, great. Perfect. You're all set, Megan.
Thank you so much, Dan. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, I can. Thanks.
Great. Thanks, everyone, for spending some time with me this afternoon to learn more about pedestrian accommodations at interchanges. I'm also going to be talking about bicycle accommodations at interchanges in a lot of these slides. My name is Megan Mittman. I'm a principal at Fear & Peers. I'm in the Walnut Creek office, which is out here in the San Francisco Bay Area. And to give you some background on why I'm the presenter on this topic, this ties in with an effort that I've been involved in for about 8 years now through what was the ITE Bicycle Pedestrian Council and is now the ITE Complete Streets Council. So this is one of our technical initiatives that we have led over many years to address what is really a hot topic and really a kind of missing area in a lot of the guidance that's available to us as planners and engineers. As we were brainstorming several years ago at a TRB meeting on an important technical topic for the council to take on, this one really rose to the forefront, and it was because a lot of our members were doing bicycle and pedestrian planning in cities where they had already kind of done all the low-hanging fruit. They'd already done that 1.0 version of the plan, and now they were needing to go back and do 2.0 and really fix those areas that were bisecting the cities and were kind of really keeping complete networks from being able to be developed. And a lot of the reasons why those were being cut off and the networks weren't really being kind of fully available to users of all ages and abilities was because of the interchanges that were present in many cities. So we over a series of many different conferences and meetings with many technical panels, it pulled together what is basically a kind of set of consensus recommendations on different iterations of on-ramp and off-ramp configurations. And the majority of the material that I'm going to be presenting today is the outcome of that multi-year effort with professionals and experts from all across the country who came together for that. And I'm the chair of this new Complete Streets Council, and if you have any questions on that, I'd also be happy to answer and provide more information on that. We just finished our first year as a new council, and we're really excited about ITE creating a Complete Streets Council. So where does the freeway end? You're going to hear me talk about speed and about perception and expectation a lot, and certainly freeways fall into that category quite a bit because they are the opportunity to either continue the message of being on a freeway onto the local street or tell someone who's on a local street they're already on the freeway by the way we design them, or to do the opposite, which is to make a very clear statement that you've left the freeway and now you're in a community where people of all modes and all types of users should be present and should be motorists should be looking out for them. So a lot of this has to do with slowing it down and making it very obvious in terms of the expectations for all modes and making it welcoming for people of all modes to be navigating through these locations. This often is the critical component of a community in terms of being able to have real mobility and have walking and biking be an alternative mode. And of course there are people who this is their primary mode either by choice or necessity, and having freeways bisect areas where we do have desire lines, where we do have land uses, where we do have reasons that people are going and want to walk and bike there is important. However, of course, that has to be balanced with the mobility needs of vehicles at interchanges, and I think that's what makes these types of trade-offs and design decisions particularly challenging, is because there's a lot of demand and need for freeways to work, for freeway interchanges to work for a lot of different users. In particular, when we talk about speeds, it's the geometry of the ramps that drives a lot of the speed. And anytime we have free flow conditions, which often we do in both the on and off ramp portions of an interchange, we have challenging, often uncontrolled interactions happening between vehicles and pedestrians and vehicles and bicyclists at high speeds. So key issues involve expectations. If there are not very many pedestrians, and often there are not many bicyclists in these areas, either because they don't feel comfortable or there are not that many reasons land use-wise they need to be there, it keeps expectations even that much lower that you're going to be interacting with those types of users. Speeds really do create an opportunity for, when collisions happen, for much more intense injuries and fatalities to occur. We have discontinuous facilities. I talk about one of the signs that we should put in the MUTCD is the good luck sign, because we could put that at a lot of our interchanges right now, right? You see that a bike path or a bike lane comes right up to the start of it, and then it just disappears and picks up on the other side. And we see that with sidewalks either not being present at all on structures or maybe only on one side. Lighting is a major consideration, especially underneath an overcrossing where you have all kinds of difficult kind of hidden areas where pedestrians might be waiting to be crossing the street. Unmarked crossings, again, kind of just this general expectations that there wouldn't be pedestrians and bicyclists at these locations, so why provide for them? And so there just are not facilities at all in many cases. Definitely poor sight distance, both just because of the angle that we're designing the ramps, as well as some of the obstructions that might be in place, and for sure long crossing distance, especially if we have really sweeping ramps that create large radius, or if we have really large signalized intersections that have multiple lanes that people have to cross. So there are some resources that are available out there. The most recent on this is the draft recommended practice that ITE has released. It's available in the bookstore, and I've finished all of the response to comments on the final round of edits, so I'm expecting that the final proposed recommended practice should be out pretty imminently. That is the most recent, and it did kind of refer back to some of the other state and local efforts to put together some documented design guidance on this topic. But there is nothing at the AASHTO level, at the federal highway level, in terms of this is what you shall do to accommodate pedestrians and bicyclists. So I'll be talking about some specific case studies and some specific configurations of on and off ramps in the next several slides, but I think it's really important to start with what we call the guiding principles in the IT recommended practice. And I think why that's really helpful is because there are so many different types of interchanges that we were not able to go into all of the different iterations of in the recommended practice, that the application of these guiding principles to those, as well as to large intersections, it can kind of help extrapolate from this document into other types of scenarios that you may find yourself in. So first and foremost, providing those ped and bike facilities. I've been mentioning that in terms of kind of if there's an expectation that why would someone want to be walking or biking here, maybe that's the only way they have to get somewhere, maybe it's because they are choosing to do that, and in many cases it's because we've actually provided land uses, we've provided bus stops that they need to be there, and this is their way to be able to have mobility. So provide those facilities, slow things down. That's going to be the most common kind of recommendation you'll see in a lot of these iterations is how can we change the ramp geometries to have slower speeds occurring where those conflicts between pedestrians, bicyclists, and motorists occur. Locate the crosswalk at the split the difference location, and I'll show you examples of that. So not the most direct, not the shortest, but halfway in between where it's the most visible and the slowest speed. Some specifics on bicyclists, and these will be more obvious when I show you some pictures and graphics of these. We often will have very long on-ramp dedicated lanes on the arterial before you get on the freeway. And when those on-ramp lanes, whether it's one or two dedicated on-ramp lanes, is 200 feet or longer, we have a different recommendation in terms of where you place the bicyclists. So rather than keeping them to the left, you keep them to the right and then move them to the left. And there's what we're calling a merge zone that is then put in place during that, kind of moving them from the right to the left. And then also selecting crosswalk treatment. So a lot of the crosswalks in an interchange configuration are going to be uncontrolled with no stop sign and no traffic signal. And so using a lot of the best practices that we know of in other contexts in terms of when we need to do more than just paint two white lines on the street to improve pedestrian safety are applicable in an interchange context as well. So just do it. Don't fail to provide, but provide the right level of accommodation that is needed for the context that you're in. A lot of this is cumulative, so for those of you who have taken the Planning for Pedestrian Safety 101 and other of the 201 modules, you'll see that there's bits and pieces of the crosswalks and sidewalk and intersection design best practices that kind of roll up into this interchange module. For sure, providing the buffer for pedestrians is one of the most important things we can do to improve comfort and reduce their level of stress as they walk through a really complex location such as an interchange. And so providing them a dedicated and buffered space to be able to be along the arterial is a very important best practice. It also helps for the ADA provision of ramps at the intersections. Providing high visibility crosswalks as a baseline, in particular for any uncontrolled crossing, so that pedestrian crossings are very visible to the motorists. Providing signing to make sure that the crosswalks are visible from advance, but of course not over-signing, and over-signing is definitely a concern and usually a good indication that the design itself is not working well at an interchange when you see that they have to be over-signed. The benefit of raised islands and medians is definitely in place for interchanges as well, breaking up the crossings, allowing you to pay attention to one direction at a time, and then also kind of signaling again that you're now in a local area, you're no longer on the freeway, and this is opportunities for placemaking and streetscape too. Enhancing beyond just signing and striping for the uncontrolled pedestrian crossings is going to be really important at a lot of the on and off ramps where we have high speeds. And so testing for rectangular rapid flashing beacons, for pedestrian hybrid beacons, and for pedestrian signals will be really important to improve the yield compliance for crosswalks. But again, not over-signing it and not making it so cluttered that it's difficult to navigate for all the users. So let's talk about the crosswalk placement. I mentioned it's the split the difference is kind of the approach that we're recommending. So you have three choices when you're looking to place a crosswalk across a ramp. You can place it at the most direct route, so this is just kind of where you're going to extend the sidewalk directly to the other edge of the sidewalk. The challenge here is that it's the longest distance, and so the most exposure time that the pedestrian is going to face. And they're also going to be crossing with their back to traffic. Here you can place it at the location where it would be the shortest distance-wise, but what you can see here is that this crosswalk is a lot less visible to the turning vehicle who's now on his way to the freeway, and is also the place where they've already accelerated through the turn. So it's splitting the difference, and this is the location where it's not too far out of the pedestrian's way to access it, but it's highly visible and the acceleration has not yet begun for the motorist. So now I'm going to walk through a series of different kind of iterations that basically go from the least complex to the most complex on the on-ramp and off-ramp side. And I'll touch a little bit on some of the more kind of innovative interchange configurations that are out there, but mostly refer back to the guiding principles so that we don't kind of go through all of those, as well as because the ITE recommended practice, it does include the single point urban interchange, the SPUI, as a case study, but does not touch on some of the others in specific. So starting with kind of the most basic and least complex of the interchange configurations. This is an on-ramp where we have, it's just a shared right turn to get onto the freeway here. So I'll pull up some bubbles here so we can see some of the key features, and what you'll notice is these kind of accumulate. So we'll talk about the first set of these here, and then as I add a different layer of complexity to the ramp configurations, we'll add some new tools to the mix. So here you can see that we've really tried to square off this on-ramp as much as possible to make it be as close to turning right as we can, while still making sure that we're accommodating the typical design vehicles, and of course that's going to be trucks in this type of situation. We're dashing the bike lane in advance of starting the ramp, and so that's just to kind of give the cyclist and the motorist an early alert that conflict is coming. One of the kind of key things that you'll notice in all of these is that these are pre-NACTO, some of the innovative devices in many cases, because we started this 8 years ago, and also because we're completely MUTCD compliant with the recommendations here. So certainly green bike lanes, either throughout the entire interchange or through this conflict zone in particular, is something that you could add on top of here. An optional exit ramp. So you might be familiar with this type of device from designing roundabouts. So the idea here is that we want to provide an on-street option for cyclists who want to be on-street, but we also want to provide an off-street option for cyclists who don't want to be on street. So giving them an opportunity to leave in advance of the conflict occurring, and to then go ahead and use what ideally becomes a Class 1 trail shared use if we can, if you have enough width. Otherwise, just allowing for bicyclists riding on sidewalk is going to need to be permitted by ordinance. The thing that this really does benefit, if we think about what type of enhancements you might put on that crosswalk, if you end up with an RFB or with a pedestrian hybrid beacon, which you're likely to in some of these later more complex configurations, that now is a device that can serve the bicyclist as well. And especially as our detection technology gets better, we're able to use that even more effectively. Making sure that we're ADA compliant with directional curb ramps, truncated domes, high visibility striping for all of these uncontrolled crosswalks. And then this is splitting the difference location as well, and we've been consistent with all of those crosswalk placements throughout. This is a really critical one in terms of getting rid of what we call the multiple threat. So in a lot of scenarios, we see queue jumps added on on-ramps so that an HOV vehicle is able to bypass a queue during congestion periods. When you start that queue jump at the crosswalk itself, so at the beginning of the crosswalk, you are enabling a multiple threat scenario to happen where one driver yields, and in doing so, the pedestrian can't see what's happening in the other lane, and the driver in the next lane can't see the pedestrian. So you lose a little capacity on your queue jump by starting it downstream of the crosswalk, but you eliminate the multiple threat. And so that's the best practice here that's being recommended, is go ahead and provide that if you need that storage, but provide it downstream rather than introducing that multiple threat. Often it means, we'll show some other scenarios where you have then kind of a dedicated lane and an option lane, and the option lane is there for the queue jump. And so not only do you have that multiple threat, but you're setting up a really confusing scenario for through bicyclists on the arterial by doing that. A landscape buffer, as I mentioned before, in terms of the sidewalk zone system, if you're able to put that in, if you have the right-of-way too, that's going to make it a lot more comfortable for pedestrians to walk through the interchange. So now we're at the next iteration, which is now we have a dedicated right turn lane, but it's less than 200 feet, so we're calling this a short right turn lane. So what you're seeing here is a configuration that you should be used to at a conventional intersection, where the best practice is to keep the bike lane to the left of the right turn to avoid that right hook, so you don't have the right turning vehicle crossing across the bike lane. But what's different in this configuration is now we have still a single lane dedicated right turn lane into the freeway, but it's now longer than 200 feet. And the 200 feet was a guideline that we kind of crowdsourced through all of the different conferences and sessions that we took this to over the years, and that was kind of that number that really came out of the mix of how long somebody's going to feel comfortable riding as a bicyclist with vehicle travel happening both to the left and to the right of them. So for about 200 feet, that's uncomfortable but manageable, but longer than that, it starts to get very stressful. So the concept here is that because this is longer than 200 feet, you're keeping them to the right, and then when you get about 200 feet out, you're merging them across to then be to the left before the on-ramp diverges from the arterial. Again, this is an excellent location for using green striping. I think that a way that we would typically do it would be to go ahead and green stripe it out here and then actually do full lane bars all the way through this kind of conflict zone, and then green lanes when you move it to the left, so that it becomes very, very clear where that weaving action is happening, where that conflict zone is. And the point here is that you're able to get across in an area rather than in a single point, so that the bicyclist can really be looking for kind of that most comfortable place to make their way across. And that, again, is just trying to reflect what we heard from a lot of people that they're doing in practice in terms of kind of where they feel most comfortable, rather than kind of being told, right here, right now, you need to cross what could be a pretty busy stream of traffic. And then this is the next level of complication here. And of course, this is one where in all of these configurations, we still are providing the off-ramp, but I think this is one where many people may choose to take the off-ramp approach because you do still have this weave zone that's happening, but now you're weaving across 2 lanes of traffic. I think that there is an argument that should you even provide this at all, but what we've tried to do is to, in all cases, have an opportunity for people to stay on the street when they want to stay on the street. And I think using green paint here to emphasize the conflict zone would also be helpful. This is likely one of those cases where you would do some type of beacon, if not pedestrian hybrid beacon, on the crosswalk. And if that ends up being the implemented device for the crosswalk, that certainly is going to be a benefit to the bicyclist to be able to exit and use a trail and then be able to cross using a pedestrian hybrid beacon. What you see shown here, and this is using California yield laws in states where this is a stop for pedestrians. This would, of course, be an advanced stop bar. But this is, if this does remain an uncontrolled crossing, the very important additional treatment of putting these advanced yield limit lines to reduce that multiple threat that's going to happen when you have the two lanes here. And you do see that we have tightened this up as well quite a bit, right? So that the turning speeds that are happening at this location should be quite a bit slower than they conventionally would be. I'm also recommending putting in a raised landscape buffer at this location. You now have a situation where a bicyclist is going to be traveling with 2 lanes of travel on either side of him or her, and so having a raised landscape buffer can help it feel like they're not kind of only protected by paint. Here's just a photo simulation example of how that kind of 2-lane treatment could be enhanced. You see the advanced yield limit lines coming in here, as well as the installation of a rectangular rapid flashing beacon on the crosswalk. So this is the example that I was mentioning earlier in terms of what we see a lot in terms of providing that HOV queue jump option. And so what's happening here is you've got a dedicated on-ramp lane leaving the arterial, but then you have this second option lane for people that are in HOVs to have an access. And of course here you don't even have the crosswalk striped, but often you see a scenario like this where you do have the crosswalk striped and you're setting up a multiple threat that's avoidable by just starting the HOV downstream of that crosswalk. You're also really creating a situation for the bicyclists where they don't know where to position themselves because of that option lane and the chances that a vehicle might kind of suddenly be cutting them off as they're trying to travel through. So why you don't see that as one of the cases is because it's just not recommended. In the ITE guidelines, the recommendation is to pick one. If you need 2 lanes, then do 2 lanes. Otherwise, just go ahead and keep it at 1 and start that queue jump downstream. Okay, so moving on to a similar kind of progression on the off-ramp side. So this is a scenario where we have no dedicated receiving lane on the arterial. So we've got, and it's split, so you have kind of an eastbound and a westbound off-ramp scenario. So one's coming in here and the other one would be the loop coming in over here. And the key feature here is that it's stop controlled rather than yield controlled. You're coming in at the T, you're stopping, and then you're turning right, rather than what we see quite frequently is just kind of a very sweeping right turn with a yield control on it. This is the similar scenario, except now instead of having kind of an eastbound and a westbound split, we've got both of the ramps coming in for both directions here. Again, stop controlled, you stop and then you would turn left or stop and turn right, slowing things down and making it possible for the crosswalk to be very visible. Now we have a scenario where there's a dedicated receiving lane on the arterial. And so we've tried to adjust the geometry such that it is as slow of a right turn movement as possible, given that you do still have that dedicated receiving lane. But what you'll see now is one of the controversial aspects of ITE, and so I want to spend some time talking through this, just kind of explaining the reasoning for why we have this configuration in the manual. So what's happening here is you have the bike lane that's on the arterial, it approaches the ramp, and it has a yield control. And the reason for the yield control is not because we think from a right-of-way allocation standpoint that the bike should have to yield to the vehicles. Of course, the vehicles that are on the arterial don't have to yield to the vehicles that are exiting the freeway. This is a scenario where it's physics and that we just have determined that it's not possible for a vehicle that is exiting the arterial, or a vehicle that is exiting the freeway and coming onto the arterial to have enough time to be able to see a bicyclist that's traveling through and be able to slow to yield to them. So it's an assignment of right-of-way based on physics, not based on modal priority. What you'll see here as well is this exit ramp option for the bike lane to come over here and use the crosswalk. The goal here, as I've been mentioning otherwise, is should you have an enhancement to this crosswalk, such as a rectangular rapid flashing beacon or a pedestrian hybrid beacon, having the bicyclists have an opportunity to come over and use that crosswalk could help to reallocate that right-of-way back. This is the next scenario where now we have two exiting lanes, one dedicated receiving lane and one merge lane. And after going through many different iterations of how you would best treat this, the recommendation is signalize it. And finally, we have the configuration where it's two exiting lanes with two dedicated receiving lanes. This is very similar to the one lane with the one dedicated receiving lane scenario, except we now have a multiple threat on the crosswalk crossing those two lanes on the off-ramp. And so again, at a minimum, putting in that advanced yield limit line to address the multiple threat is going to be critical. This is also likely a scenario where a pedestrian hybrid beacon could be considered for the pedestrian and bicycle enhancement of that crosswalk. So how do you choose if this is a rectangular rapid flashing beacon, if it's a ped hybrid beacon or hawk, if it's a full pedestrian signal? There are different tools that are out there. This is one that I've helped develop called the Crosswalk Plus tool, and it kind of goes through the different contextual considerations of all the devices that have been studied. Most of this is referring back to the NCHRP 562 study from several years back on kind of the efficacy of the different devices given different contextual considerations. So it is applicable at an interchange in terms of number of lanes, number of vehicles, number of pedestrians, speed, whether transit's present, those types of considerations. And typically, this has a very broad range of tools that it'll recommend, but typically in an interchange configuration, it's going to be, have you met a hawk pedestrian hybrid beacon warrant or not? Have you met the pedestrian signal warrant or not? And if not one of those, then probably the RRFB is going to be the only other device that's going to be strong enough in terms of the type of yielding that you need to get. So interchange geometry, I think that's the most common thing that you've heard me talk about today in terms of slowing things down and making things more compact. It's a challenge, of course, for the speed in terms of the interaction at the conflict zone, but it's also a really uncomfortable scenario for the motorist, and in particular a senior motorist or someone with other types of physical limitations who is coming into a situation like this and really having to look way back over his or her shoulder to be able to see what's happening on the arterial and to feel really comfortable with going ahead and making that merge. And so here we see a kind of a really excellent before and after example of changing that configuration, which would have been the case here with the red curb, and teeing it up. And now instead of having what the red arrow is showing is this extremely long crossing that would have happened in a conflict zone of very high speeds. We now have a very short crossing in I think is now signalized, because often when you are able to remove that sweeping right and bring it in to be teed up, now you find that you just happen to arrive right at the signal that's already there. If not, this could be stop controlled. But you're able to have a much, much shorter crossing distance, much slower speeds. And by the way, you get a whole parcel back to the community for a higher and better use than a lot of pavement is. When it is important or necessary to provide a dedicated right turn rather than just eliminating a right turn, there are now new guidance on tightening up that angle so that the speed through which you're using that channel can be much slower than it would be otherwise. So I mentioned that we're not going to go through kind of each different iteration of interchange configuration. There are some reports out there that talk about diverging diamonds and other alternative intersections and interchanges, and what I would encourage you to do is to apply the guiding principles that I've discussed earlier in this webinar to the design of those, in particular looking at geometries and speeds and provision of accommodations for pedestrians and bicyclists in all cases. The single point urban interchange is a particularly challenging one to cross the arterial in the design of, because the efficiency of the signal, which allows one signal to operate the entire interchange, does not allow for any space in the signal phasing for a crossing of the arterial for a pedestrian. So the ITE guidance goes through a couple of different options there. One is crossing in a two-stage through the middle of the interchange. The other is crossing in advance with the PED hybrid beacon at more of a mid-block scenario. And what really is going to drive that is your desire line and where your land uses are, where people need to cross and want to cross and will cross anyway if you don't provide for it. Roundabouts and interchanges are also something that we're seeing more and more, and I think the recommendations here in our guiding principles are going to apply for that, as well as making sure that we're following all of the recommendations that are coming around, that are coming out in terms of ADA considerations for roundabouts, in particular multi-lane roundabouts, and potentially providing pedestrian hybrid beacons on those crossings. In terms of retrofitting existing interchanges, most of the techniques that I've been talking about are obviously applicable to new designs, but can be applied to retrofitting. The geometric changes in some cases are going to be very costly and very difficult, but in other cases it's not. In other cases it's just really going to depend on topography for the most part in terms of how difficult it will be to square things up. This is an example in Colorado of a retrofitted intersection or interchange that did provide a wide enough path through the intersection that now pedestrians and bicyclists who had previously not been able to navigate through this are able to pass through. And then that's it. So I would appreciate answering any questions that you have. Dan sent me some questions that many of you had in advance, and I do have some other slides at the end, so if you have some questions that I already have some slides on, then I will skip ahead to those and be able to refer to some of those in my responses.
Oh, great. Thank you so much, Megan. We did get a lot of good questions, and feel free, folks, to keep rolling those in. I would like to keep it on your slides, if you don't mind, Megan, because I think we may be able to refer back to a few things that you showed and all that. First, just some clarifying questions, I guess. There were a few questions that came in when you were showing the recommended placement for crosswalks at the entrance ramps, where you talked about kind of splitting the difference between sort of that perfect alignment with the sidewalk and then a perfect sort of perpendicular shortest path sidewalk. Some questions about the truncated dome and the ramp placement. It kind of looked like on some of these diagrams that the ramps were sort of angled out into the street as opposed to lining up perfectly with the crosswalk. Is this just something going on with the image? And in reality, you obviously would want the ramps to be sort of perpendicular and facing directly at the crosswalk.
Yes, absolutely. So these images are good for showing the split the difference. They're not good for showing the orientation of the ramps, and that definitely should be changed so that it's completely aligned with the direction of travel.
Great, and that makes sense. I think there was just some confusion about that.
Fair enough.
I think it's actually getting to the point where you're doing the designs and getting that on the ground. I think you would certainly want to follow the principles of making sure that those domes are placing people in the correct position in alignment with crosswalks.
Yes, and we did pay very careful attention to that in the ITE diagrams. This one isn't from that, to make sure that the orientation of the ramps in each case was the way that they should be done.
Great. Just a general question, and this isn't even really something, you could just maybe comment on this, Megan. It seems like we're talking about interchanges specifically with freeway designs and things like that, but it seems like interchange and freeway design principles of these like long sweeping turns are sort of omnipresent in locations even where they're not bringing one arterial to another, or not even a freeway design. From your perspective, I mean, is this it's sort of we're working against a relic of a time when freeway design sort of took over just our normal streets and roads?
Well, and kind of the suburban land use patterns that require us to have so many arterials. But certainly many of the design recommendations in here are applicable to large intersections. We do have many situations where you'll have a right turn pocket that is longer than 200 feet, and so this kind of weave zone technique for bikes would be applicable in that scenario, and for sure the geometric changes to slow things down would definitely be applicable in those large intersections too.
I'm curious about the you showed when bicyclists are coming across and where the off ramps bring vehicles onto the road, and the bicycle has to yield then to the oncoming to the off ramp traffic. Can you explain a little bit more about that? I think it may seem sort of counterintuitive when you think about a bicyclist is traveling straight and should pretty much be able to go straight as they normally would.
Right, and so in this scenario, we're not showing that, right? Because you have the bike lane feeds into the bike lane, and there's it's very clear whether this is stop or yield control, that it's possible and that you can slow things down enough on the exit that obviously the bicyclist should maintain the right-of-way and should not be interfered. So it's this scenario here where now we have the bicyclist that's traveling here, but now basically a new lane on the arterial is introduced to become a receiving lane for the off-ramp. And so I have a zoom in of that here. And so what happens if you were just to say that the bicyclist should maintain right-of-way and that they should basically just be able to continue straight across without having a yield control kind of put on the bike lane, the concern is that even though you have squared this up as much as possible and you're slowing things down as much as possible, a motorist that's exiting the freeway, would they have enough time to see a through-moving bicyclist coming along the arterial and be able to yield to them? And so it's not, do we want them to yield to them? Do we think they should yield to them? It's, are they physically able to yield to them? Because, and the difference with the bikes and the pedestrians is the speed at which the bike is traveling, right? So it's just reaction time. Are you going to see them in enough time to be able to stop and yield? And that was the concern and the reason for the configuration. My preference here is that this is a case, especially if we have quite a few bikes and pedestrians, that we put something on the crosswalk such that that forces the yield, which a pedestrian hybrid beacon would force the stop. And then the bicyclist is able to trigger that in advance and retains the right-of-way. So it's physics rather than a preference. And if you have follow-ups on that, or if that's confusing, I'd be happy to try to continue to describe it.
I think that makes sense, and I think that you're only you may be using this in a situation where I mean I could picture a situation like this where it might if you have a high crash occurrence bicyclist at a location like this might be an option to look at if you're concerned about that movement as maybe going back taking a look at a design. So, yeah,
that makes sense.
One other question here. A lot of questions actually, Megan, about the DDI design. And I think you did put some slides together with that. I wonder if it might be more appropriate to go ahead and cover some of that material.
Sure, I can go ahead and skip to that. The ITE guidance does not cover that, mostly because 8 years ago it was the SPUI that we were talking about a lot, and I think it was as we got towards publication, it was more when the DDI. So let's see if I can flip over to these. So, okay, so of course the challenge with the diverging design, diamond is where do you put the pedestrians because you're crossing the lanes of travel over to be contraflow and you need to figure out how the pedestrians who are going to be going through and across the arterial are going to be accommodated. So here's some pictures of kind of the options here. So if anybody hasn't seen it, so basically you're approaching, in our conventional right side of the street, you get into these two signals on either end and you cross over, and what this enables to do is have these kind of free-flowing left movements in either direction. So it's just a lot more efficient for the operations for vehicles. So similar to the SPUI has been a big efficiency improvement for vehicles at these interchanges. So the challenge is how do you get pedestrians and bicycles to also be enhanced in terms of their movement through it. So a typical way that's being facilitated is to bring the pedestrians through the middle. And so I'll show you a picture. So it's either putting these kind of outside walkways, and what you see here is the dots are the different kind of crossing points of all of the ramps, or you bring them through at the signals into this kind of center walkway, and they would be crossing it at these different points. This is an example of one in Missouri of where they did bring the pedestrians into the middle, and I think conventionally this is also kind of, this was treated as a class one, the bicyclists on a path would also be brought through here. I don't think any of these examples show bike lanes going through here. So this is what the pedestrian facility looks like in the middle of the DDI. Benefits are that you have a physical barrier separating you, that the crossings to get here are signalized. Of course, the constraints are it's not a particularly aesthetically attractive place to be, and you also may have some personal safety concerns with kind of being a pedestrian stuck here kind of in the middle of this walled off corridor, walking through quite a long area. That said, in the Missouri case, they did have positive feedback from the pedestrians who used it. And it does save bridge width because you're providing just kind of one centralized location for the pedestrians to be, as opposed to having to provide paths on either side. This is just some more examples of how you would kind of access that, and you can see here that the access point into that centralized walkway is controlled. You still end up having many times the uncontrolled crossings. Here you can see it here in this picture of these of the off-ramps, and so I think that there are some enhancement opportunities even in the DDI case to look at geometric improvements so that you don't have really sweeping off-ramps. This is an example of if you were to bring the pathway. This is actually pretty similar to kind of how the design of a SPUI often looks for pedestrian crossings too. I think what you see here is there are quite a few uncontrolled crossings that end up happening here. You also, it's pretty meandering, and so that's another one of the challenges, is that this could be quite of an out of direction process for pedestrians to have to go. Many crossings, the benefit when they're signalized is that they're controlled, but of course there's a delay component to the signalized crossings too, and that delay could be pretty great if the cycle length is pretty long. So I think that the difference in which one you would choose is really going to be kind of what your kind of available right-of-way is within the interchange, as well as kind of where the desire lines are for pedestrians in terms of if you put them in the middle, is that severely restrict their ability to get to the destinations that are nearby. Let's see if there's some more pictures here. This is the pedestrian's view. So definitely some sight distance concerns here because of the structure. And pedestrian signals have been used in some of those cases to improve the sight distance concerns. So that's what I have on slides there. I'd be happy to answer any specific questions. I have not myself been involved in a DDI design too, so if there's others on the call that have specific expertise in that, or I'd be happy to refer you to somebody if you have any really detailed questions on a DDI.
Yeah, well, I would just encourage, I think we've got definitely some strong feelings on the DDI from some folks on the line. I mean, it certainly doesn't seem like the most comfortable place in the world to walk based on some images. I think that there's a range out there of look and feel for a DDI. I've seen a few that I like more than others, and so I'd be encouraged maybe if you all have a DDI that you're especially proud of in your community, if you can let us know about that one. It would be great to be able to point some people to some nice examples. The one thing that struck me in one of the initial images was just the that long sort of continuous concrete sort of corridor or trough, I suppose, that it seems like without some shading or something, depending on the location, it might be a fairly uncomfortable place to walk. But I mean, as you pointed out, Megan, it really it's a trade-off. I think one of the trade-offs is that versus the sort of multiple conflict points by putting it on the outside of where all the interchange or the ramps and exit ramps and entrance ramps are. So I mean, things to consider. But if you do have examples out there of really nice examples that you'd like to share with us, feel free to drop those in the comment box. We'd be encouraged to see those. I think one of the questions I want to get back to, Megan, you mentioned, obviously we talked a bit about the truncated domes, some of the placement of the curb ramps and things on the crosswalks. Anything else specifically for interchanges that you're aware of that can specifically improve things for individuals with disabilities, vision impairments, things like that? These can certainly seem to be very challenging crossings for a lot of people, despite the fact that many of us may not have those same challenges to have to work with. So anything you're aware of that might be, a starting point for looking at how to improve conditions for individuals with disabilities at interchange locations?
I don't know that there's a set of tools that are going to be specific to interchanges, but certainly potentially prioritizing some of those tools because of the complexity and intensity of an interchange crossing. So looking at the walking speed that's assumed, likely they've assumed as fast of a walking speed as possible in the timing, just because there's so many movements that have to be served. But going ahead and making sure that that's 3.5 or slower feet per second, putting in some vibrotactile push buttons to enable better awareness of when it's your phase for crossing, making sure that you've separated your push buttons so that it's one push button per crossing and those are 10 feet apart. So I'd say it's more just kind of positive practice on ADA design than it's going to be anything specific for an interchange, but certainly making sure that you've remembered to do that and prioritize to do that. I think lighting is a really important piece of this too. I've been through so many interchanges where there's just like these basically like completely hidden pockets because of the shadowing. It could be midday, but it's completely dark under an overpass, and you can have really difficult challenges, in particular kind of seeing somebody who might be in a wheelchair waiting to cross because they're kind of hidden in a dark corner. So I think that could be an important consideration as well.
Yeah, I think lighting did come up quite a bit from the participants on the webinar today, just asking about basically that issue of it can be a bright sunny day, but then as soon as you're coming into and then out from under an underpass, possibly it would be a challenge for sure.
Definitely.
Another thing too is, we it gets beyond lighting, but maybe some just sight distance issues in general. I wonder how much safety conditions, things having to do with late merge and all kinds of other vehicle movements could be simplified by just having better wayfinding, maybe leading up to and out from an interchange location. It does seem that they are fairly chaotic areas, and there's a lot of information being delivered at one time, and that I wonder if you have a thought about how that contributes to pedestrian or bicycle safety. It's just another thing that drivers aren't looking for.
Well, I think that's where the squaring things up and slowing things down is such a value as well. And I think that sight distance is not only going to be improved for the ability for vehicles to see and react to pedestrians and bicyclists, but also for vehicles to react to other vehicles. There are a lot of obstructions and a lot of really challenging angles to be navigating through, and many of the ways that we've designed interchanges to be high speed. And I think so then that's when you see a lot of this kind of sign clutter happening. So this is, we need to tell you really early on what lane you need to be in and how you need to be positioning yourself, because you're going to get into a very complicated high speed kind of situation. And I think things could be a little bit more intuitive or not so challenging to navigate if you were just going a little bit slower in the navigation of it.
Are there any other strategies that you're aware of, Megan, aside from the examples you shared about the geometry at the ends of these, maybe the ends of the ramps kind of requiring vehicles to slow down? Any strategies you're aware of to really reduce vehicle speeds on the off-ramps coming down interchanges? I'm aware of sort of some maybe like rumble strip type treatments to get kind of drivers to better understand that they're changing position from a freeway to an arterial or to a normal, to more of an urban setting, I guess. So any other thing you're aware of? Somebody even asked about if there was anything with regards to enforcement of speed on off-ramps. I've never really seen that, but what other strategies are you familiar with?
Yeah, certainly, and enforcement education are good pairings with this. I think that there's also kind of that signaling of a change in land use, and so kind of a good example to point to is where the Central Freeway has been removed in San Francisco and it's now Octavia Boulevard. You get off the freeway and there's palm trees everywhere, and that's before you even get to kind of the first intersection, and it's very much a gateway. It's very much, you have left the freeway and you are in a neighborhood now. And so I think that there might be some landscaping signals. It's similar to recommendations we might make in a rural area where you've been on a rural highway and all of a sudden you're going to come up upon a village or town center. And so having some type of a change in landscape can be helpful for that. Certainly lighting, having the lighting become much more intense in advance of the arterial, I think could slow you down and draw your attention to your surroundings a bit more, and definitely I've seen the rumble strips in place as well. I likewise, I don't believe I've ever noticed the enforcement happening on an off-ramp, but that does seem like it would be a very helpful way. I mean, you see that all the time in gateways to a city, that'll be where the police will be positioning themselves, and in many ways this is a gateway to a city. It's how you arrive at a city when you're leaving the freeway and coming into their local jurisdiction.
This is sort of a challenging one, and I hope I don't put you on the spot with this. It's just an interesting argument that I've not heard before. Some folks on the line who have gotten some pushback from some other engineers when they're trying to tighten up the ramps, the on and off ramps, to make them more slow speed. They're actually getting some pushback from people saying that might encourage more wrong way entrances to the freeway, because a more sweeping turn is more, I guess it's easier for a driver to not go the wrong way if it's a very clearly a high-speed one-way direction, if that makes sense. I've never heard that before, that their argument is that by tightening them up, making them look like a little bit more ambiguous in terms of where the traffic is going or coming from, that might encourage more wrong-way entrances to the freeway. Have you ever heard anything like that, Megan?
I haven't, and what we're trying to recommend here is that they look more like an urban intersection than like a high-speed, large suburban intersection. And so, I mean, I think where that would be kind of a concern would be if we saw that a lot at urban intersections, that people were confused about making that. So I don't know, I guess I would kind of want to see examples of that, and if there were, what would be the type of countermeasures. Maybe it's better signage, maybe it's better kind of median that extends a bit into the intersection so that you can't make that turn. But it's not something that anybody's raised to me, and nor do I think we're recommending anything different than what you would find in kind of a typical, more compact intersection layout.
What about, there's a comment here that in some cases with very difficult interchange designs, especially some overpass designs, there might be pushes to just build either one of two things: build the pedestrian bicycle accommodations along another street that crosses near that interchange, so the bike path accommodations aren't actually at the interchange themselves. There may be an alternate route a bit downstream, or building standalone kind of bicycle pedestrian bridges aside from the interchange itself. I mean, I can certainly see drawbacks to going that route, but are you aware of agencies that have just said, retrofitting the interchange is too difficult, we're just going to put in the bridge or possibly add the features to an alternate route?
Yeah, there's an example on, I think it's US 40 or 50 outside of Sacramento, where Caltrans did just that. They basically tunneled underneath one of their off-ramps for a bike ped kind of undercrossing, so that you just don't have to cross the ramp at all. I think the total project, it wasn't just for that, but it was about a $40 million price tag, I think is what I heard on it. So you can see the trade-offs there immediately just in terms of the price, but in that case it was kind of the community preferred alternative, and a better option for everyone. To me, it's always efficiency and desire line, and we see this all the time. It's kind of very similar to the case of should we install a pedestrian overpass or underpass question, right? And so it's is it directly serving and efficiently serving the desire line and the land use destination that the pedestrians and bicyclists are wanting to use. In some cases, the topography is such that it actually does a better job of it than otherwise kind of bringing them into an on-street situation would be, but that's pretty rare. I've seen many occasions where you'll see a pedestrian overcrossing and everybody's crossing underneath it because it's such an out of direction travel to get to use it, and it's not serving kind of the front door or the most efficient way. So I think that you have to approach it very carefully in terms of making sure that that very expensive solution is going to be the solution people will use, because if people have another reason to be on the street, and in particular if these are people that are using the street not as recreation but as kind of a mode of transportation, often that's going to really be out of their direction and not kind of serving the through movement that they, just like the motorists, want to have.
Megan, you talked a little bit when you're talking. You talked about the crosswalks at on-ramps and how you're kind of splitting the difference between the perfect, shortest path or situation of the sidewalk. You showed some examples with rapid flashing beacons and some other supplemental signage. Are you aware of any cases where advanced RFEs or advanced warning systems have been used? Because it does seem like that even though you're splitting the difference to bring the pedestrian a little bit closer to the direct sight line of the vehicles that are in that lane, it still may take someone by surprise after they begin that turn. Any advanced warning systems that you've seen out there?
I don't know that I've seen them in interchange context. I have seen them, I was referring to kind of this being not so dissimilar from kind of rural highway design. So I have seen them around Lake Tahoe. There's some kind of trail crossings where there's a beacon at the trail crossing itself, but there's also one about 90 feet in advance, and it's actually linked up so that it only is on if it detects that there's a trail user on it, on the trail, and then it will alert you about 900 feet in advance of the trail crossing itself that there will be a pedestrian or bicyclist at the crossing when you arrive at the crossing on kind of a blind curve. So I think that there are potentially opportunities to use that same detection technology, and some of that may be helpful as we kind of think through that kind of ability to yield and to be aware of a user kind of approaching, and potentially that could be something that could help with that right-of-way dilemma that we're running into with wanting to give the through bicyclists right-of-way in that kind of off-ramp scenario, but being concerned about enough advance notice that the bicycles will be there.
You showed the example of bike off-ramp in advance of the interchange, right. And I'm wondering if is your recommendation also to at that point widen the sidewalk, or is the expectation that the bicyclist will dismount and walk the duration of the interchange if they take that option?
Yes, we know they're not going to dismount. Even if that's what you're telling them to do, that's not likely to be what will happen. So I think in an ideal world, it's to widen it so that it's at least 10 feet wide, so that it really does become a multi-use trail. And where it's not, if it's not sufficient width to be able to classify it as such, then I think that you at least need to consider changing the local ordinance either to allow it citywide or at least to allow it through that particular location for bicyclists to be on the sidewalk, because they will be. And I think that if you haven't provided another option for them to feel comfortable on the street itself. I haven't mentioned buffered bike lanes. I haven't mentioned cycle tracks. And the reason for both of those is, as I mentioned, we're fully MUTCD compliant and also a few years behind on kind of what the latest and greatest is. And so that's your best option if you have enough room and you're able to make some decisions to provide an on-street facility, to provide a buffer, even better to provide a cycle track option so that you have that trail feeling on the street itself. But that was not quite where ITE was ready to go and where the national guidance was ready to go. So this does kind of default a bit more to a side path than I think that it should when you're looking at the kind of full toolbox that we have available to us now.
Megan, I think we're getting a little bit into sort of accommodations on bridge territory here because they're very closely related. I won't go too far in that direction. However, there's a question about just generally an agency is looking at their interchanges. Some of them, a lot of them, may not even have the sidewalks and the other features to begin with. Looking for a place to start, is there a recommendation of sort of how you evaluate these areas to determine where would be a good first place to go ahead and back and put in some sidewalks and other ways to facilitate that crossing? Because I think in a lot of places, people are seeing pedestrians and bicyclists crossing and using these interchanges, whether they're sidewalks or bike lanes or not.
Yeah.
Do you have recommendations on sort of how to hit those priority areas?
Yeah, so I kind of mentioned that one of the kind of reasons why the Ped Bike Council took this on as a technical topic years ago was because we were hearing so much from our members that as they were doing citywide bicycle and pedestrian planning, that these locations ended up being, primary barriers that really kept them from being able to develop complete multimodal active transportation networks. And so to the extent that you're working in a jurisdiction that has a pedestrian plan, has a bicycle plan, has an active transportation plan, look to that in terms of priority. So either these are going to be locations that have already been identified as priority locations, or there's going to be some prioritization metrics that will have been kind of decided in the planning process that could be applicable in terms of, maybe you have 10 interchanges in the city and you only have funding to retrofit one of them, which one hits the most of those, high priority metrics for the city. So that would be, and in the absence of that, you could do kind of a similar kind of prioritization process just for interchanges. I've been talking with Caltrans about how they are going to be thinking about going about and doing this, and they are expecting they're going to need to do something along that line statewide, right? To a two-part process. One is to determine where to start, and then the other one is to maybe do kind of a Caltrans specific version of what I've presented today, because of course there are many more iterations of interchange configurations, and as they seek to actually put something on the ground, there is a need to really kind of look at more of the examples than just the ones that are kind of prototypical, to really work through the trade-offs and the design guidance that's needed for those.
Megan, is it your, I guess from your perspective, do you think the fact that so many interchanges and bridges and things lack pedestrian features is due primarily to sort of a cost-cutting element and the fact that when they were built there were no pedestrians there, so it wasn't thought about? Or do you think it's some element to sort of deter pedestrians and bicyclists from actually entering the freeways themselves? Do you think there's concern about that? We're getting some comments about agencies that are even still hesitant to put a sidewalk up to an interchange because they're afraid that it'll lead to people walking along and onto the freeway itself and bicycling.
I haven't run into that. I mean, I think it's just kind of asking yourself the question of, does the fact that you don't have bike lanes and that you don't have sidewalk there keep people out? And I think it's largely no. If they need to be there, they're going to be there, but now they're just in the middle of the street or in really unexpected places, or they're feeling like they would like to make a choice to ride or walk to work or to school, and that choice is not made available to them. So I don't think that it has to be one and the same to provide through movement local street access, and to think that that is also an invitation to walk or bike onto the freeway itself. Same would be true with railroad crossings and others, that we have intermodal and inter-facility interchanges a lot that doesn't necessitate that every mode has to interact with every other facility that they interact with.
Megan, we got some comments or questions, I guess, about the SPUI.
Yeah.
So I wonder if you'd be able to hit that. And then we actually even got a question about the peanut. Somebody knows what that is. So that would be great. I think that would answer some of those questions.
Okay, let's see. So I'm a little bit better on the SPUI than I am on the peanut, but so I'll start with that first, and then I'll try my best on the peanut. All right, so single point urban interchange. The reason I didn't put it in the base slides is because the more and more I talk about it, the more and more people say we're not doing those anymore. And so it does seem to be potentially on the downside as maybe the DDI and others are coming up. But certainly they are in place. This one's actually about one interchange from where I'm sitting right now in Walnut Creek in Concord. So the challenge, see a picture of it. All right, okay, so it's really efficient in that one signal controls every signalized movement of the interchange. The challenge is every vehicle phase is going to at some point conflict with an ability for a pedestrian to cross. So there is no opportunity to basically kind of fit a full crossing of the arterial in without having some direction of vehicle phase conflict with it. So there's basically two options, and the selection of the option is really driven by what the pedestrian desire line is, where the pedestrian is going, and whether or not that's very close into the interchange itself or whether it could be efficiently accessed by kind of approaching it outside of the interchange. So if there is a need to cross them within the interchange itself, then there needs to be a raised median so that you can do a two-stage crossing. And that two-stage crossing needs to be, let's see if they, I don't know that they show it as well in this configuration, as I think it's really important to do it. So it needs to be staggered, just like any two-stage crossing needs to be, because you need to not see the second phase of it as you're crossing, to not be confused that you can continue all the way through. All right, so it's going to cross you to the center, then you need to walk down the median in the direction of oncoming traffic to a second crosswalk that would then cross with a separate phase. The other option, if the desire line for the pedestrian is not within the kind of limits of the interchange itself, is to cross them in advance. Okay, here's a good drawing of that, so you can see here that you're walking through a staggered median in the direction of oncoming traffic, and you'd cross once and then cross a second time. And there's opportunities for coordination with downstream signals in doing this as well. This is the option if the desire line, the locations that you're trying to walk to, are far enough out. And so this is, where are the front doors of those buildings that you're trying to get to? Where are those bus stops? And in a situation like this where you would put these mid-blocks in, it's very likely you'd need to put a PED signal or a PED hybrid beacon on those just because of the speed and volume characteristics of the interactions that you're going to have with vehicles there. So that's the SPUI. Any questions on that, Dan?
Oh, sorry, Megan, I was on mute. Did we say what the SPUI stood for? It's a
single point urban interchange.
Great. And the DDI again is?
The diverging diamond interchange.
Great. Thank you. That's not perfect. Thank you.
And then, okay, so the peanut. So the peanut is basically a pair of two roundabouts that enable you to kind of cycle through an interchange with, rather than having signalized intersections with free movements as part of them or not, you now have a roundabout on either side. They have these in Truckee, not too far from the San Francisco Bay Area here. They're proposing another one on Gilman here in Berkeley, and I've seen several others that have been in the proposal, but I don't know that they're that common yet. We might have some pictures of some in Carmel. Yeah, this is Carmel, Indiana, which is kind of the roundabout city. So it's really efficient, right, in terms of all of the benefits that you get for roundabouts, also the safety benefits that you get for roundabouts, because you don't have the left turn conflicts anymore. I think that there's the challenging considerations are going to be the same as the challenging considerations for bikes and peds as relate to roundabouts. Largely that comes into play with respect to multi-lanes. So for pedestrians, it's crossing of multi-lanes. You see right here that we've got an uncontrolled crossing of a two-lane here, so there's a chance for a multiple threat there. So potentially putting some type of enhancement on that, or looking for opportunities to make these single lane if we can, reduces the multiple threat. Bicyclists, when these are designed such that people are going 15, 20 miles an hour through them, then it should be relatively comfortable for a bicyclist to just take the lane and ride with traffic. But having exit ramps available for the bicyclist to use a path through the side is important for that. And I don't know if we can see in the picture here, but that should be an option here for the bicyclist to both have an on-street and an off-street. There's considerations for sight-limited pedestrians that you really use the direction of parallel traffic to be able to navigate through an intersection. For the audible navigation, that roundabouts don't play well to that, because you have vehicles approaching from many different angles, and so there has been some recommendations to use pedestrian hybrid beacons on crosswalks for that ability to kind of be able to use the navigation aspects of a crossing signal for pedestrians to mitigate that concern. So that was kind of my extent of knowledge about the about roundabouts and pedestrians and bicyclists. Certainly, it's really efficient from a vehicle circulation standpoint, and a lot of safety benefits. It's also just beautiful, right? In terms of like this picture is just the streetscape and the gateway aspects of it are really positive. It's expensive to do something like this, right? This is kind of done to like the platinum level, but I don't think that every roundabout configuration would need to be done with this enhanced aspects of kind of the streetscape design in addition to the intersection design. Caltrans here in California actually does have a requirement that any new intersection and intersection kind of enhancement has to be looked at versus a roundabout alternative. So kind of applying that requirement, we may start to see more of these here, which is, I think, probably a very positive thing.
Yeah, absolutely. No, it does look really good. I wonder how new it was when they took the picture and all that. Yeah,
it was not in a drought.
Yeah, right. So a couple of questions, and this doesn't just apply to the SPUI. It could apply to this example here, some of the other examples about, are there any good examples you have of almost like pedestrian level wayfinding in advance of some of these crossings? Because as you showed in the SPUI example where the crossings may be further downstream from the interchange, almost like there's another level of information needed for somebody to know, I need to go ahead and cross here if I'm going to end up on the right side at the other end. And so I wonder if you've ever seen any examples of sort of pedestrian level wayfinding on how to navigate through some of these. And that could, I guess, apply to the DDI as well as some other features.
I haven't. That doesn't mean it's not out there. I mean, I've certainly seen many great examples of good pedestrian wayfinding and good, bicycle wayfinding, bicycle boulevard wayfinding that I think would be really applicable in situations like this. But there's not a specific interchange design that comes to mind where I think that they've done a really excellent job. I think the important, consideration in that is that the DDI does pretty well with wayfinding in terms of kind of advanced signage for where you position, and lots of times there's like really good kind of colored stenciling in the different lanes if you're going eastbound, westbound, so that you really know where to position yourself. But I can't think of examples of where the pedestrian and bike wayfinding has been nearly as effective in an interchange, but certainly kind of learning from some of the best practices for downtowns that have done really good pedestrian scale versions of that. Monterey, Yountville are two close by here that have done a really good job with that for pedestrians, and of course Berkeley is a really good example of that for the bicycle boulevard wayfinding.
Megan, you've done a lot of work on sort of looking at recommendations for different types of crosswalk markings at different locations. When dealing with interchanges, is it pretty much uniformly recommended to go with this high visibility styles, or are you seeing a lot of agencies kind of using the parallel line? And they're all, most of the examples you've shown, they're uncontrolled crossings. I assume you'd want to go with the high vis.
Yeah, definitely for the uncontrolled. And my typical recommendation is uncontrolled everywhere in a city gets the high visibility, and controlled maybe not, just as a way of kind of making the uncontrolled pop. That said, in kind of the chaos and complexity of an interchange, using high visibility at every crossing I think would be appropriate, just in terms of making it really clear where pedestrians are. You for better or for worse, are likely to have some legs that are marked and some legs that are not marked in a interchange scenario, because you're going to have certain sides of kind of the intersection that won't really be serving any land uses at all, because they'll kind of be on the side of the overpass or the underpass. And so in that case, I think for pedestrian navigation and vehicle visibility and awareness, a high visibility would be important with advanced stop bars as well when it's signalized to help with encroachment.
We had another webinar on medians and crossing islands, but there was a question here about the width. When you showed the two-stage crossings on the spooey. What sort of widths are you looking for to accommodate that two-stage crossing? I think it was this one, and maybe, yeah, this is it. This is it.
Yeah.
What width are you going for on something like that?
At least 6 feet. So you need it to be wide enough so you can have a bike, right? So that's kind of the minimum, and that's obviously challenging to make it fit if you don't have one there currently. And that's as you know. That said, it's challenging to make it fit, but I bet you most of these are going to have 12 to 14 foot lane width, so maybe it's not that challenging to make it fit because you can drop those lane widths down quite a bit to be able to squeeze one of these in. But 6 feet is the minimum that's recommended because that's kind of the length of a bike, and you can expect that somebody's going to need to be able to fit a bike in there.
And a couple of questions, getting back to one of our earlier conversations about speeds of on and off ramps. Are you aware of anyone who's trying a bit of sort of lane narrowing, I guess, lane dieting at interchanges to kind of get those speeds down, particularly on those on and off ramps? And because I think oftentimes you'll see those ramps being fairly wide, and I'm wondering if that's something that's just a standard design, or is there flexibility there to kind of narrow those lanes down to sort of get to that speed that you want vehicles to be using?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know that I've seen that specifically in an interchange context. Certainly, we see that at intersection context. That we actually have that in my neighborhood where they've kind of put in kind of a striping around a lot of the corners just to kind of make it such that you turn a little bit tighter around the corner. So they've kind of striped in shoulders all throughout the neighborhood, and it certainly does slow it down because you kind of have something. It's almost like the elephant tracks on any turn. It kind of, this is where your car should be tracking as you're turning. I think the challenge is making sure that the pedestrian doesn't interpret that striping in particular almost kind of like a painted out bulb out that would be kind of serving as a safety zone for them to be waiting when they're crossing the street. And that's always been my concern about kind of using paint as a pedestrian refuge area in lieu of something that's actually physically present. So I'd say if the reason that you're doing something like that is for then doing more than just paint is probably really important so that you don't give that kind of implication to pedestrians that there's now a zone, so soft tip posts, kind of an asphalt curb, something that would be painted white, something in addition to just paint, but that could be more of kind of an interim design measure before you actually can fully build it out with curbing gutter might be something that could help.
Okay. A question that came in about, a few questions on this topic, but specifically this one, there's an agency that is getting a lot of pushback on sort of that narrower entrance ramp or ramp throat kind of design due to a lot of volume of truck traffic. And as I'm sure almost all interchange locations are going to have a decent amount of truck traffic.
Right.
Any kind of examples or recommendations for sort of identifying those trade-offs, and I guess you could throw emergency vehicles into the mix as well.
Yeah. So you can probably tell because these are not particularly exciting graphic quality drawings that we did them in CAD. And that was because we got really early feedback when we were developing this and had done it more in Illustrator and more kind of cartoon style drawings that's not feasible, that's all well and good, but we actually have to get trucks through here. And so everything we've done has been done to scale and has been done using turning templates of tractor trailers. So that was a primary consideration in showing these samples, is that they, and all of them were done by taking a currently built template and then retrofitting it. So they're kind of real world examples that have just been enhanced. So there's an absolute recognition that interchanges have to accommodate trucks.
Okay. Any examples, Megan, of or in your guidance? I guess this is just one example of many that you have. Were there any examples that specifically called out cross sections where multi-use paths were coming through an interchange, and whether if you do have any of those, does that change anything about these designs, or is it really just kind of widen things out and add more space and place more emphasis on the crosswalk, things like that?
Yeah, I think that the recommendations that we're making about slowing things down are, that much more important when you have the key difference with the multi-use path is the expectation that essentially like a bike would be riding on the sidewalk, right, or on the path. And so the ability to be able to detect and react to that cyclist, in particular if you've got a downhill situation or something like that, is important. I don't know that there's anything kind of more specific to an interchange versus kind of those types of crossings in general. And we don't get into signal control discussions and that, but whether or not you're going to have bike phases and dedicated signal phases for the trail crossing is more of an operational discussion than kind of the sighting, striping, geometry that we've done, or the striping and geometry things that we've done here. But I think that those are layers that you need to add if you had any sight distance concerns, and if you weren't able to adjust the geometry such that really the only way that you could get that trail crossing to safely navigate those ramps would be to signalize it.
Of all the arguments that we've heard against head and bike accommodations at interchanges today that have been cited in the comments, the one that seems to be the most commonly cited is just the general trade-off or battle between moving pedestrians and bicyclists safely through interchanges, and arguments that it'll increase delay, it'll hurt capacity to have these vehicles, particularly if you're thinking about vehicles kind of backing up an off-ramp into the freeway. I mean, these I don't know that there are foundations for a lot of these arguments, but do you have any arguments if you were to talk to somebody who made that argument, what would you say about that efficiency question? I mean, is it truly something that if you allow peds and bikes to cross and travel through safely, are you really hurting capacity that much?
Yeah, well, I think there's a lot of different considerations there, and I think that safety is the compelling reason to do it. Safety is also, for all modes, a compelling consideration, and the backup onto the main line is a legitimate concern with this, right? So changing the geometry of the ramps, the length of the ramps was designed assuming their current geometry, and so it is important to make sure that if you're going to be changing the speed and therefore the capacity of those off-ramps, that you have kind of appropriately design the main line so that you're not going to cause vehicle safety concerns on the freeway because of what you've done on the off-ramp. I think kind of an important consideration really is kind of when these major safety considerations are happening, right? So when the worst of the safety problems are happening is when the highest speeds are happening. And the highest speeds are happening during the times where you're not congested, right? So what we're trying to do is really to slow things down during those off peaks. During the time that it's congested, the speeds are already kind of slow there, and you're not going to, the change in the geometry is not going to be making that huge of a capacity difference in those considerations because, that capacity is already probably being driven by, some bottleneck downstream on the arterial or something along those lines. So it's, where you'll see the biggest increase in delay is likely to be off-peak, where you might have been able to go 50 miles an hour at an off-ramp, and now you're going to have to go 20 miles an hour at an off-ramp. But that's, you're going to be the only one on the road at that time. But it is those scenarios where the speed is going to be the highest and where the safety issue is going to be the most. And I think it's important to really try to make sure that you're not conflating two different issues into one as a way of kind of failing to provide accommodations. And a lot of this is for cities to grapple with complete streets policies, with multimodal level service, with built environment factors and other kind of comfort-based metrics to make sure that vehicle level service isn't the only metric that's being put in place for decision-making purposes. I'll get off my soapbox.
I think that's a great way to tie everything together, and I think that's a good place to leave it. We don't have too much more time, unfortunately, and so that's all the time we have for questions today. Megan was kind enough to put up her her email address, I think, Megan, on your slide. If you could flip back to that one while I'm going through the rest. If you get a chance to get your question answered, I'd encourage you to reach out to Megan, reach out to myself. You'll be getting the email from me later today, so you can just reply to that. Let us know if you have another question that we can help you with and point you in the right direction. Megan shared a lot of resources, and so I'd encourage you to go to those slides that are on our website now and take a look at everything that was shared and maybe follow up on some of those guidance documents and some other things. I think you'll hopefully be able to find your answers there. But unfortunately, that is all the time we have for discussion today. I want to remind everybody of a few things. One, you'll receive an email later today with a link to the archive page for these webinars. It already has the PDF copy of the slideshow from today. And we also are going to be adding the recording of the webinar from today. I think that it will take just a few days to get this one up. Hopefully it'll be up fairly soon. But just check back to that page to view the video or to share the video with somebody who wasn't able to attend. I also wanted to let you know that the email is going to contain a link to generate a certificate of attendance for the webinar. Be sure to pass that along to your colleagues who are joining the webinar with you so that they can also print out their own certificates of attendance. I also want to let you know that when you leave the webinar today, you're going to be greeted by a very brief survey. We'd really appreciate your feedback on our performance today, on the webinars, or the webinar that we delivered. We do have a few more episodes in the series, so any feedback that you can provide to us that'll help us out with future sessions would be very much appreciated. I just want to thank Megan Mittman again for such a great presentation and responding to all those good questions. I want to thank you all for attending the webinar today and asking all the good questions. And I hope you'll attend some of our future sessions. So with that, I'll close the webinar. Everybody have a great day.